Hello, and welcome to A Dash of Salt. I'm Dr. Shelley Ann, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you stumbled upon this podcast by accident or you're here because the subject drew you in, welcome. SALT is an acronym for Society and Learning Today. This podcast was created as an outlet for inviting fresh discussions on sociology and learning theories that impact your world. Each episode includes a wide range of themes that focus on society and everyday learning, whether formal or informal. So let's get stuck in, shall we? Welcome to A Dash of Salt. Today I'm joined by Eoin O'Donoghue. Eoin is a teacher of history, economics, and business who has taught in post-primary context in both Ireland and England. He's also an occasional lecturer in economics at the UCD School of Mechanical and Materials Engineering. Eoin holds a first-class honors Bachelor of Business Studies honors degree from Dublin City University, a first-class honors master's and a PhD in history from University College Dublin, a first-class honors professional master in education from Trinity College Dublin, and a postgraduate certificate in education from the University of Buckingham. Eoin is also a fellow at the UK Society for Education and Training and earned Qualified Teacher Learning and Skills Professional status with them in 2018. In 2012, Eoin was awarded an Irish Research Council scholarship to facilitate his doctoral research in medieval Irish history. Earlier this year, he was presented with a John O'Connor Award for Excellence in Business Studies Teaching by the Business Studies Teacher Association of Ireland. You are very well educated, Eoin, and I'm delighted to have you on the podcast today to talk to you about the contribution of doctoral education in post-primary teaching. Welcome, Eoin.
Thanks a million. I'm delighted to be here. A lovely way to spend, well, we won't say what day it is, but lovely way to spend the day.
Lovely way to spend a dreary day in Ireland. At least it's dreary where I am.
Same.
Eoin, please tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background in education, and your professional experience.
Yeah, when I left school, I went and studied business studies in DCU, and then I developed an interest in history, so I went and studied history. I was privileged enough to be able to do that. And when I was doing a doctorate in medieval history, I had teaching experience in the UCD School of History. And that really kind of kindled a flame inside me. I really, really enjoyed that experience, and I wanted to get better at it. And so by the time I'd finished my doctoral research, I had decided to make the move into teaching as a career, and specifically post-primary teaching. So I went over to England, where I was able to get a job teaching without having prior teaching qualifications, but where I could get them on the job. So I did that, and I landed a job teaching economics and politics at A-level in a school over there. And then I decided I wanted to come home to this lovely island and our lovely economy. And yeah, so when I came back, I did a master's in education in Trinity, and I've been teaching in the Irish sector since.
So while your PhD research was in Irish history, your professional master's post-PhD focused on human capital contributions and the impact of doctoral education on the professional operations of teachers in post-primary schools in Ireland specifically. So what is it about this topic that interests you?
Yeah, it really stems from my interest in economics and education, both. So obviously I love teaching, I really enjoy it, and I have this, I suppose a societally agreed notion that it is a public good. It's a merit good. It helps improve society. And in terms of economics, then I'm thinking, okay, so we accept human capital is a type of capital. We can build people's skill level through education, and that can contribute to, I suppose, society, to productivity in organizations, etc. So I thought, okay, well, I'm coming at this from, a less, I suppose, and not a very common background. Okay, so there's less than 100 people teaching in post-primary schools in Ireland who have doctoral education. So I thought, okay, well, what might how might I suppose, explore the extent to which doctoral education does impact on things like productivity, the ability of one to teach in post-primary education in Ireland. So I looked at this from a theoretical perspective first. So looking at human capital theory, and this has its origins, I suppose, in I think in practical terms it has its origins far back in time, but in terms of economic theory, it has its origins. You can start with Smith and the Wealth of Nations. So he acknowledges that that you make an investment in yourself to become educated, and that can I suppose pay dividends for you, because it gives you access to more earning potential, and it contributes to the wealth of the nation, basically, to the economy. And this concept became developed within the neoclassical school of economics, and you have people like Schultz, and basically their studies are all about measurement of human capital. So it's very much from the quantitative economics perspective, which is obviously the mainstream in economics. So you'd be looking at studies that would try and quantify human capital contributions by maybe looking at growth in GDP, or earnings of individuals with certain qualifications. What I suppose I'm less interested in the quantitative side and more interested in the qualitative side. And what I noticed was that, okay, so human capital theory is closely associated with the neoclassical school of thought, and it's very much about that measurement. But there's evidence to say that John Maynard Keynes, that he recognized, as one would expect, education to have a positive impact on productivity. You can even see this in Marx. So even though Marx seems to understand the impact on productivity is happening through the average of worker skills, there's still an implicit acknowledgement that the state of the art, the state of the discipline, and the worker skill level can impact productivity, even if it is through an average. So this kind of suggests that even if there are problems with neoclassical human capital theory, fundamentally, all the theoretical perspectives are pointing to the possibility that education can have a positive impact on productivity. So that was my theoretical basis. So then I was like, well, okay, that's all well and good, great. We've established something that we all kind of know and accept. But what about this particular case? So I thought, okay, well, look, how am I going to investigate this? So I decided I would take a qualitative approach. Now, it's quite rare in economics. But there's a professor from MIT, MJ Piori. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Piori, maybe. But he has used qualitative interviews to inform his analysis of things like labor markets. So I thought, okay, well, this is something that's possible. I could set up semi-structured interviews with teachers who have doctorates and investigate, I suppose, their perspective on how their doctoral education has contributed to their work and their ability to do their work, i.e. to productivity in the post-primary sector in Ireland. So that's what I went and did. Now it was a preliminary study. It's not meant to be conclusive in that we can't extrapolate these results onto the whole population. It was a fairly small sample, but the idea was to collect some primary data that would allow further discussion. I'm a big believer in that in academia, by the way. I really believe that we should be doing preliminary investigations, and we should certainly be putting theories out, because scholarly dialogue is important, and you do that through publication. Not all academics would agree, but that's something I believe in.
No, absolutely. I agree for sure. And because the other thing is when you get that preliminary data out there, it gives opportunity for others who maybe will pursue that further and delve deeper into it based on that preliminary data. So it is, like you said, it's extremely important. I just wanted to clarify one thing. You said that in Ireland there's less than 100. Is that what you said? People with doctorates that are teaching in primary or second or post-primary education?
Yeah, right? I got this data from the Teaching Council. So they maintain a database with all registered teachers under the post-primary route, and I off the top of my head, it was either 89 or 87, back in November 2019 when they gave me that information. There was 87, 89 people registered with a doctorate under the post-primary teaching route. So that's a proxy for this figure. I mean, the exact figure might be slightly different. You might have some people who've entered the profession since, some who've retired. You might have a few who are on the further education route but are actually working in schools. You might have some people who haven't informed the teaching council of their doctorate. There are all sorts of stuff like that. But I reckon it's a good proxy, and we're probably talking about just under 100.
Yeah. And I loved that you did take a little bit more of a qualitative approach, because I am a firm believer that there's so much rich data that you can receive, through the lived experience, interviewing people on their lived experiences. For as someone that had read, your small scale research in this area for your PME, there was just so much interesting information that came out of there, and there was so much rich data, and those, you did have some, quantitative data in there to really help validate, as an as somebody who's an expert in economics would do, but it really made for rich reading. And I'm not generally one to love reading like fully quantitative studies. It's just not my thing. I'm very much about the human experience, and quantitative data doesn't often give you that human experience. So when I was able to read and critique your thesis, I was just blown away about with how warm and engaging it really was, considering that you did sort of a bit of a mixed methods kind of a approach there. It's probably it is the best and one of the only ones that I've read that I'm like, I would read again and will, read over and over again, because it's engaging and it's inviting, and the data is just so rich. And like you said, there's an important, context there that it needs to get out and it needs to be heard. You need to make sure that you continue to disseminate the important information in there. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, I mean, that's very high praise indeed. Thank you very much. No, I fully agree. And that was one of the things about it. I didn't anticipate the level of rich data that I would collect from it. Really interesting. Obviously, within that, then drawing conclusions, it's very, I suppose there's a methodology there where I'm collecting individual people's rich descriptions and perceptions of I suppose their experience, that it's not readily transferable onto a wider population, but some really interesting anecdotes and descriptions in there.
Yeah, and we're going to get into those a little bit more, because I'm really interested in you putting out there like what some of your participants had to say about their experiences as, somebody that holds a PhD in teaching in, second level education, and we will get to that here soon. But first, the other question that I have for you here is, the PhD is often referred to as a terminal. This is still all about you, okay? So the PhD is often referred to as a terminal degree, because it's the highest attainable degree that somebody can get. But you, sir, decided to go back to school after you did your PhD to do your professional master's in education. What made you decide to do that? And what was that experience like as somebody that holds the level of PhD back in a master's program with a lot of pre-service teachers who very young, so you'd be considered more of a mature student?
Yeah, great question. And there's not a single answer. There's a combination of things here. So one, you could argue by necessity, okay, which is never a great way to start going into education. I mean, I'm a big fan of education, but there's an element of necessity about the specific choice I made. So I had studied for a postgraduate certificate in education in the UK before that. The one I did was through the private sector. There's a different setup over there, and therefore it didn't meet the national criteria for the public school system, and by public I mean state-run school system in the UK. Therefore it wasn't readily transferable when I came home. And that left me very little choice, because I have a vocation to teach, and therefore that made me choose to do the PME specifically. I would, however, have come back, and I would have, perhaps not in the first year, but as soon as I built up a little bit of capital, I probably would have gone back and done an MEd or something similar anyway. So I suppose the PME gave me that opportunity to engage even deeper in theory, because I mean, well, it is I suppose your I suppose your basic key into the profession now. You can take from it whatever you bring into it, so I went in having had research experience in the past, so I could delve and put as much work into it as I wanted, and I found it very rewarding from that point of view. So I learned a lot more about foundations and things that weren't covered on the UK course, because, well, the relative quality of the courses is possibly one thing, because this is a 2-year master's in Trinity. As opposed to the other thing was part-time, very much teaching on the learning on the job. Very valuable too, but very different. So I suppose necessity is one thing, but the other thing is that love of learning and that opportunity to learn more about foundations, and specifically in an Irish context, where I wouldn't have had that from the UK.
Yeah, and you would definitely be an example of somebody who's passionate about lifelong learning, for sure. Do you feel that you contributed, that you were able to contribute to the learning of your fellow cohort?
Yeah, I suppose I did a bit. Yeah, made a good few friends. We'd thrash things out together, and in the same way that we all share. Like I don't think it was anything very much, because I'd done a doctorate or whatever. But I suppose I had a familiarity with I suppose academic requirements, which certainly I could pass on to other people.
You've talked a little bit about working in the UK, and you did talk about some of the standards and how, when you came back to Ireland, we know that, the Teaching Council has very strict standards about the qualifications that one must have in order to be able to teach here in Ireland. Now that you've been teaching here in Ireland and you've taught for some time, first of all, what age or grade levels did you teach in both places, and what are some of the differences between teaching in the UK and teaching here in Ireland that you've experienced so far?
Yeah, great. In terms of what age groups I've taught, so in the UK I mainly taught senior level, so A level and AS level, so that would be more or less your equivalent of 5th and 6th year here, senior cycle. But I did have a couple of younger classes as well. Over here I've had first, second, haven't had third. I think I've covered third a few times, and I've had fifth. I've had sixth for resource hours, but I haven't had a class of my own in sixth over here. But basically a widespread across both, to be honest. Nothing that impedes a comparison, let's say. In terms of my UK experience, then, I mean, I was 2 years over there. And I probably didn't have the most typical experience for Irish teachers who go over to the UK. I've heard from colleagues I've worked with in Ireland who have a background in the UK as well, that they were often in state schools that were underfunded. There was even violence and things in the schools, some really shocking things. I didn't have that experience at all. I was in a private school, a private boarding school, a very privileged environment. And you had both locals and international students coming in there. So, you can imagine the money probably involved and the, just the privilege and the lack of deprivation when compared to underfunded state schools, So I think it might be entirely, the comparisons, they're in that context. But I think big ones that I suppose transcend that would be the curriculum. So over here, obviously, we teach the Leaving Cert primarily. There's like 1 or 2 schools who teach IB, I think, but it's essentially Leaving Cert. It's a government curriculum and a government exam assessment. In the UK at A level, there are different private exam boards, and basically the curriculum, I suppose the specifications, the subject specifications are different for each. The exam requirements are different to each. So that's something I noticed. I do think, and this is only a personal comment, I did quite like the A-level curricula that I came across. I thought what they did very effectively, because they have time when you only study 3 or 4 subjects over there, maybe 5 if you're exceptional, as opposed to here where you do a whole suite. What I did like about that was that the quality of knowledge that students engaged with, and the range of higher order thinking skills that students engage with through the curriculum, I think are higher than what I've seen on the ground in terms of the Leaving Cert. And that's not to say the Leaving Cert's useless. I don't believe it is. But I do think that there is a noticeably higher level at A level, and I think it can be very valuable. And I don't think that it's even. I've often heard people say, well, yeah, but you're sacrificing a broad education for that depth. I think you can get a broad education, the years preceding that. I personally like that system. So that's one thing I'll say about the UK system compared to here. Another one was class size. Now this is probably to do with the context of the school I was in, but I had small class sizes, and I found that made giving detailed feedback much more fluid, much easier essentially. I mean, in one class I was teaching, I had 3 students. Now the norm is about 12, but that's quite different from a norm of 25, 30. So that was facilitating kind of better formative feedback, much more in-depth formative feedback. But that also fits the nature of the work that the students had to do at A level, because they had to do essays that were quite in depth, that aren't too far off first year university in many cases. So that's another thing, class size. But again, that's probably very specific to that private school context. In terms of people always ask me about paperwork. Was there much more paperwork in the UK? Yes, there was. And it was pointless paperwork. It was nonsense, in my opinion. That's a strong thing to say, but I really believe it. A lot of it seemed to me to be a management tool, and to get in the way, actually, in terms of teachers having time to do their actual job and add value to teaching, to students. So that was something I noticed. There was a lot more reporting and things like that. In fact, even reporting to parents, which obviously has a lot of utility. Even the size of the reports and the frequency of the reports were higher, and it made me wonder, with my business background, to what extent is this actually helping in terms of formative feedback to students and parents and communicating that? Because you do that anyway. You give parents a shout if there's something wrong, etc. You'd have a chat. It's in addition to that. But I'd be spending my Saturdays and Sundays writing reports every few weeks, and like the whole day, and you'd be wondering, okay, is this just so you can, when you go to a career fair when you go to a recruitment fair to try and get international students to come over on board, just to say, look at the detailed feedback we give? Is it only a marketing exercise? And I wonder about that. I might be wrong. It might be just being cynical, but poster responsibility as well. I notice, again, it's only based on one school in the UK, but I notice over here, in my experience in all the schools I've been in over here, and I've been in a few, people with poster responsibility actually do the work, and they actually are a major help to the rest of the teaching staff. They lighten the load for everyone else. What I found in the UK, in the one school I was in, was kind of the opposite. It was like people were being given these, I suppose you'd equate them to middle management positions, where they'd bring in an initiative. It was almost like they're branding themselves for the next interview. And all that really did was give more work to teachers who were already, busy doing work. Right. And yeah, you get the point. Yes. And so the conditions as well was another issue over there. Again, my particular experience, we often complain, and perhaps rightly so, over here about issues like payment, and certainly I've been the camp of pay inequality is wrong. However, my experience in the UK was pay and conditions for teachers were worse. And especially in the private sector, and perhaps it had something to do with the position I found myself in, that the school would have been aware of. But at one point, now I wasn't working full-time in the school, although, I wasn't contracted full-time in the school. I was working full-time in the school, more or less. But like at one point, they tried to give me an annual salary of about $8,000 or something. And on the rate I should have been on their rates, it should have been about 17, 18, which is still very low for the amount of work that went into it, So I do feel that's a major difference as well. But I think that speaks to a wider economic problem over in the UK at the moment. And then interviews, big difference as well. Over there, when you go to do interviews, you have to teach class. It's very standard, whereas here, no, you go and have an interview, you have a chat with a panel, and show off, essentially, show that you can do the job. And there you'd have that, and you might have 2 or 3 different interviews in the day, and you would also teach a class.
Wow. Yeah, that's a very extensive interview. And anybody who's job seeking and job hunting in the field of education or anywhere, when you get an interview, you're wanting to put your best foot forward, and you're really investigating the school, and you're finding out about their mission and vision statements, and their processes and things like that. And so that's very time consuming. But then to add on that, having to present to a class, as well as this full suite of interviews that you have to go through, it would just be exhausting. And especially if you're going up against whatever 10 8 10 people or whatever, to know that there's that possibility you've put all that work and investment in, and you may not be number one candidate
in one instance, I remember, and it wasn't my interview, but where I was working, 3 candidates were brought in. They spent the day together, but obviously then had to have their separate interviews and talk classes. And the atmosphere between them was not great, but it wouldn't be. It's a horrible technique to use, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's competitive, and that's very interesting. I've never heard that before, where you bring the candidates together, and it's like the gladiator. You throw them in the ring and see who comes out punching.
Yeah, it wouldn't be something I'd use if I was in that position,
No, it's like very cutthroat. Very, very interesting. Really interesting things that you've just shared with us. Thank you. When you think about educators, or when people think about educators who hold a doctoral or a PhD degree, there's always that assumption that they're either going to be teaching at higher education, or they've done the PhD because they want to hold a higher administration position. Talk to us a little bit about the experience of your participants. What were some of the positive and negative experiences of those doctorate holding teachers teaching in tertiary education?
Well, I suppose one thing to say is just about the methodology. So I ended up interviewing 4 people, which is obviously a small number of people. But again, the idea is not to sort of suggest that these 4 people are necessarily reflective of a wider population. It's preliminary research to suggest areas for further investigation. But this happened during COVID as well, which did limit the number of people. But all 4 did state that they believed that their PhD contributed to their performance as teachers in classrooms. So that's a really interesting, I suppose, not statistic, because but it's an interesting piece of data to take from it. In terms of what they thought, how they thought that their doctoral education contributed, there's various things here. I mean, problem solving came up, and in terms of that, like one of the participants mentioned that they were quite good at problem solving now because of their doctorate and because of the research they had to do and things failing and having to go back and reevaluate things, and they thought that they could model that kind of level of patience and those kind of problem solving skills in the classroom when students were struggling to answer questions or find an answer. I think we're really dealing, I don't want to give too much away on the participants, but I think we're dealing with activities here that would require the student to solve problems, so it's kind of training them into what mindset you would use. Also though, that the same individual suggested that their problem solving abilities extended to them when they were engaging in differentiation. So if they had a student who, okay, this isn't working for that student, there's obviously, you might have elements of UDL or something in your plans, but it's still not hitting that particular student. That student needs extra help. Okay, what are my strategies? And they would actually apply, even though their doctorate's not in education, they would apply I suppose their research skills into solving that problem and to investigating potential ways of differentiating more effectively. Mm-hmm. And so that was an interesting way. It shows the transferable nature of things like research skills. In terms of helping colleagues came up. Basically using subject knowledge or experience and passing that on. One of the participants noted specifically that what they'd often do is if a colleague came to them and said, look, I'm struggling with this new part of the syllabus or this new update in terms of curriculum, any advice, can you help me at all? Well, this person would, because they were in a position within their school, and there was, this person had the time and the relationships in place to do this, but they would go and they would do some research, and they would actually I suppose break down the cutting edge research and make it more digestible for someone who didn't have the same research background, and then it would filter into the classroom in that regard through their through a colleague, basically. So I thought that was really interesting. I think it speaks to the value of relationships and positive relationships in the school for that to be effective, and fair play to that participant. What else? I think subject knowledge was a huge one, and it's certainly one that I feel very strongly about. But we have a great one. One of the individuals was saying that, yeah, they would use knowledge. Actually, more than one of the individuals said this, but of one particular example, said that they would use subject knowledge from their doctoral research in the classroom to create activities or to get across points to students. So it might help them in answering questions students had, would help them illustrate points, and certainly, yeah, help them create activities. So one that was brought up was, and it was quite relevant to like the coronavirus, actually, but it was when SARS was around, I think, is when the person actually used this activity. But they basically drew on an aspect of chemistry from their PhD, and I suppose set the pupils a task about vaccine creation that engaged with a piece of chemistry theory they were looking at. It's like, so if there's a OH here, how do we get this to interact with the virus to what? I'm not a chemist, but you get the point. Yeah. So that could be brought in, and with proper scaffolding and context, yeah, kids can engage with that. They're just applying their knowledge and the theory that's been taught to them, but it's in a really engaging and really relevant way. So I thought that was really kind of magic. What else we got? We had less reliance on textbooks. That certainly came up, which we'll talk about later. So that's really a lot of the stuff in the classroom. In terms of then networking outside the school, that seemed to help. They were all comfortable with and perhaps facilitated, like, social capital, and facilitated in reaching out to universities and other bodies to get them involved in some sort of school activities. Okay, so a few examples of that, and where they were able to reach out and have them come and give a talk or lend them equipment in one case, that kind of thing. In terms of helping with communicating with parents, it was reported that there seemed to be, I suppose, relatively more respect. They certainly didn't feel that they were experiencing some of the same problems that some of their colleagues might have experienced in communicating with parents. A case of, presumably we're talking more respect there for the teacher because of the doctoral title or the doctoral education. It would need to be further investigated. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, they mentioned that it helped them with their teacher training. Not so much with things like pedagogy and assessment, but very much with their ability to engage in academic tasks. So writing essays, etc., writing reports, those kinds of things. Okay, so there are some of the positives that came up, but there were negatives as well. Negative experiences from having a doctorate and working in post-primary schools. So some people thought it might be a barrier to effective relationships. Certainly I had anecdotes anyway that suggested. One person said in one school they worked in where relationships weren't as favorable as the place they were in when I spoke to them. Someone said they were a bit too big for their boots. So there was that kind of perception that, I suppose, negative perception from colleagues, and that doesn't help in terms of a positive working relationship and people helping each other. Another person said that some of their colleagues would come to them and ask for help, but in the same school, just other colleagues who might have professional rivalries with the individual with the doctorate wouldn't do that, and there might be trouble or a strained relationship as a result. So there seems to be an area for exploration there. In terms of finding a job as well, the idea that if you have a PhD, what are you doing teaching in a post-primary school came up, and none of the people I spoke to were anything other than committed to post-primary teaching. But there seemed to be this idea that it was a bit of a stopgap. So they'd be asked by people all the time, like, why are you not doing something else? And stopgap is the word that came up. And yeah, so that seems to have been a problem. Related to that, there was a bit of a discussion about potentially impacting job acquisition. So maybe being filtered out because of the PhD, perhaps because of some prejudices like this, and whether they be grounded in truth or not. And then there was also a perception, and I put this to the participants because it's something I'd heard through my contacts. But there was a perception that I'd heard that was floating around, that people with doctorates were considered to be poor at explaining things because they found it difficult to simplify issues. And that is something that was refuted by my participants. So that's interesting too. As in the concept there was refuted. A few of them had heard the same, I suppose, misconception, let's call it. But yeah,
I think sometimes that only tends to be more of a phenomena in higher education where, the academics, but that's the difference between somebody who holds a PhD and somebody who views themselves as an academic. And that's where that sort of above speak happens. I think more in higher education, but I think anybody with a PhD, as you were saying, has all these fabulous skills that they can be able to relate their experiences and distill them down into a way that their students can understand. But yeah, I've heard that as well. But I like that that you've said it was refuted. That's really positive to hear.
I think you make a really good point there, and you wonder about and not all academics are like that either, but we definitely come across that a lot more in that field, and you'd wonder to what extent are we dealing with kind of professional protectionism and yeah. I'm thinking of Tolkien's dragons sitting on their gold.
Exactly. What about I don't know if this came up when we were talking about sort of you were talking about benefits and or positives and negatives. What about earnings? Does the earnings play any type of a role in them securing a position because they hold a higher this really terminal degree?
So I didn't ask much about this, but it came up in regards to pay inequality, and there's definitely an attitude there where yes, there's pay inequality is unfair, and it's something I personally would believe as well. So yeah, it didn't affect all my participants either, but it affected some. Because qualification allowances for doctorates aren't paid to post 2011 entrance to the profession. So.
And as somebody who went through the PME, that generally these these professional masters in education 2-year programs are often super high paced, and you're just going boom, boom, boom from one module in one piece of learning to another. I'm just wondering if you feel that that those who have a PhD have a better understanding of that teacher as continuous researcher, where that's one of the things as a teacher educator, we are often wanting to instill within our professional masters students or our pre-student teachers to be thinking about themselves as teacher, as researcher. Go into your classroom and continue that idea, that concept of lifelong learning, and that really continually looking at your classroom as a research opportunity, and and how you can be a continuous researcher. But I think they only get that in small snippets from one module to another, and it's not deeply instilled throughout the program. But with somebody who holds a PhD and knows and can appreciate that, that idea of continuous research, do you think that's definitely something that is beneficial?
Yeah, absolutely, and it came across quite strongly in the interviews as well. So we had one of the participants saying that they applied their research skills not only to subject knowledge but to things like differentiation. Another one was applying it to pedagogical methods, and I think all of them brought in subject knowledge and research and getting the latest data in terms of their field. Certainly those with subject specific PhDs. as in this, what I mean, as in the curricular, so a PhD in the curricular subject.
Mhm.
Those individuals, they illustrated basically, that yes, they did research and they kept up to date. Mightn't be with the entire curriculum, because it would be very, very onerous to do that all the time. But they definitely, yeah, they lived what you're saying. The continuous researcher teacher, they live that, and I think it must come from the PhD. That's certainly the impression I got off them, and it's also something I feel myself.
Mhm. And so, what about you, Owen? Now that you're, teaching in post-primary school, after completing this little, this lovely little piece of research that you did, what are your own experiences, the resident doctor in classroom? Do you identify with your participants, or are there places where you say, this could be a little bit different from my own experience? Again, because you have a bit of it more in international, ideas as well. But what about you?
Yeah, it very much it matches surprisingly well. It really does. My experience matches my participants. In terms of one thing I didn't mention about one of my participants, even suggested that the use of their PhD knowledge in the classroom actually helped to build relationships with students. So because the students be like, oh right, you actually, like, you're an expert in this, like you know, yeah. So that would actually build, I presume the mechanism we're talking about there is building confidence in the student, in the teacher. So yeah, and I've certainly seen how students would react differently. Now it's not always positive. Sometimes they go, oh, why is he a doctor? What do we call him doctor? And not Mister. But a lot of the time, like, especially if you're actually, talking about the stuff that you've a research background in, yeah, I think that really does inspire confidence in the students. In terms of subject knowledge, absolutely, I think it's really important. I think um, you can definitely bring that into the classroom. There are a few examples of how I've done that in the past. So one of the things that really annoys me about history at a post-primary level is misconceptions, historical misconceptions. And so basically quality of subject knowledge, really, that's disseminated through the system. And it's nobody's fault. It's just we all need to do better and contribute to try and improve it. But one of the things that really gets on my nerves is somebody did, early Christian Ireland, early medieval Ireland as their specialist area, is when people talk about round towers, like we have in all the monasteries like Glendalough, and they talk about them as places of refuge. If the Vikings are attacking, and especially if they talk about that being the function of the building, like why it was built, they're bell towers. Their Irish name in both early medieval Irish and updated into modern Irish signifies that it's Cleethach, bell house essentially. So I remember bringing this up with students. Now the situation is that if a student writes it's a place of refuge in an exam, they're going to get the marks. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's the expected answer in the exams. So you want to be careful. Like I have to be really careful about, okay, how do I kind of make my point, get this to be useful learning exercises for students, but not disadvantage them or make things too complicated. So one thing I did was I sort of explained that, yeah, you can write that down because, there is actually a historical example of someone who did seem to hide in the bell tower when a monastery was attacked. Just wasn't very successful. They were burnt alive from the bottom, from a fire being lit around the tower. So, well, yeah, basically what I'd say is, this was to a class of first years as well. I said, imagine you are in Glendalough. Does everyone know what Glendalough looks like? Most of them did, not all of them did. So, okay, we'll paint a picture. It's this deep valley here, okay? There's, presuming there's trees up on around the mountainsides, etc. Obviously, we're not 100% sure what it looked like back in the day. But you live here. This is your home. You know this landscape. Now, there's a group of raiders coming in. Okay, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to run away. Okay, so where are you going to hide? Yeah, okay, we're not going to hide in the big tall tower in the middle of the settlement that's being attacked. We're going to go into the hills where we know and hide. So, you're allowing students to think through the problem
That
and
it's
then
not really a
question.
place of refuge like the language dictates.
Absolutely. So it's you're getting them to think through the problem and, you know, question the knowledge with, I suppose, logic, you know. So that would be one way that I've, you know, it's a very specific example, but one way that my subject knowledge from my doctorate would end up coming into the classroom. There's other ways as well, you know. So even outside, I suppose when I say subject knowledge, we can talk about procedural knowledge as well here. So even though my doctorate's in early medieval Irish history, I mean, I learned how to be a historian and how to, you know, do the role of a historian. So it doesn't have to apply only when it comes to early Christian Ireland. I can, you know, teach how to think like a historian to students. I created an exercise where I had a bunch of primary sources for students that all had contradictory data. So it was basically, I was basically talking about my own great grandfather, who was a police officer, and I put a picture up on the board and everything, and they were like, "Oh, this is a real person. That's so interesting." And I was like, "I have a problem. I can't figure out his birth year." It was a lie, but you know. I said, "Here's all the sources, and they all have different dates for his birth year. So you're going to have to help me figure it out." And I'd give them the context of the sources. You know, I'd say, "Okay, so this is a baptismal record. This is his gravestone, you know, and all that." And you know, I'd be using these examples to reinforce the basic idea that a primary source is, you know, from the time being studied. So if you have a particular question, your primary source from the time being studied, and the most reliable one is going to be the one that's closest to the time being studied. So, you know, students would be prompted and supported through this exercise, but they would get there in the end, or at least some students would come up with it, and everyone would learn from that, oh yes, the answer is, you know, 1848, because the baptismal record would have been made at the time of his baptism, whereas the grave wasn't made until much later in his life, so it's a much later source. So these kinds of illustrations that can really bring to life basic theory and basic definitions for students, and allow them to use higher order thinking processes to access that. I think that's something that, for me anyway, the doctorate helped me bring into the classroom.
Mm-hmm. And you're making it so real and alive, you know, with examples that, rather than just opening a textbook and sort of, you know, let's read this you know, where, you know, the history can get skewed at, like, you know, specifically me coming from, you know, the country that I was born and raised in, where, you know, history can become very skewed because it was, you know, very much textbook taught, and the textbooks were, you know, created and aligned with certain, you know, philosophies and, you know, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of really important historical information that was missing.
Absolutely.
You know,
And
so
that happens here too. You know, I mean, we're still over reliant on textbooks, and there is a move away from it. And you know, fair play to, you know, the academics and the teachers involved in that movement. But on the ground, you know, there's a heavy reliance on them, and the textbooks themselves, obviously, yeah, are a product of a particular outlook. You know, and that has roots to, you know, this country's history in the same way that, you know, the textbooks you grew up with had, you know, links to your country's history and past. And yeah.
But the, you know, the criticality that you give the students because you've had that experience, you know, and that ability to be critical and to, like you said, question, you know, question your resources, question your sources, question where this is coming from, and, you know, and come to a determination, you know, that most appropriately suits, you know, I just think that your example was fabulous. That's, you know, that's a great way to just really make it alive, and really important for students, to help them to sort of not just get information fed in, but to actually take the time to critically analyze at their own level and at their own pace, and, you know, to come to a richer understanding.
Absolutely. And you know, as I say, this can come up in so many ways. And with history, it's very easy to go down the primary source route, you know, and the analysis of primary source route. But there's a whole strand of the specification which is about that kind of knowledge. It's about procedural knowledge and interpretive knowledge. And you know, another example here, when I was teaching Columbus to students. Now, the new specification is great in that it is very critical of that period of history, but you know, you still have to teach them the basic narrative as well. I wanted the students to really live the experience of being on a ship, and I mean, with COVID, we were very limited in terms of active learning methodology. So it's, people were just sitting at their desks. There's nothing greater you can do there. But I said, okay, if I can bring in a primary source into this, that might, help. As opposed to, it'd be brilliant if I could act this out, basically, but you can't do it with the current restrictions for obvious reasons. So brought in some extracts from a primary source, basically, that talks about Columbus's voyage. And I cleaned it up a bit, made it a bit more readable, user-friendly for students, and got them to go through and answer questions about it. And things like, how might they have fed themselves? Well, they brought supplies, but they also went fishing. So the kids are reading this and they're going, hang on, they're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and they're going for a swim and they're fishing. It's like, yeah, they got off the ship, like they could just get off the ship and go for a swim and the weather was all right, And we have this in primary sources and the kids are like, oh, this is so cool. And I'd also tell them, like, if I didn't know something, because I'm not a Columbus expert. So it's like, well, I don't know that, but like we can read through other parts of the primary source and see if we can get an answer, So I do believe that, like, again, focusing on the methodology there and illustrating that methodology and giving students the skills to do that is important. Obviously, it's not everything, but it definitely helps, and it definitely comes from doctoral research for me as a historian. So yeah.
Yeah. So, we've talked so much about, the different things about how important it is to continually research and how important it is to, always be thinking and questioning and that kind of thing. And I know that you've recently published a new article on the use of social media to disseminate post-primary teaching resources and high quality subject knowledge. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, this really feeds into what I was just saying, actually. Yeah. Soapbox, But yeah. So the piece is basically arguing that social media and social media networks that are already in place and are developing give us a real opportunity as a profession to share our knowledge within the profession. So I'm somebody with obviously a doctorate in history, and that has given me a certain amount of expertise in certain areas. By no means does it make me an expert in the whole course. Absolutely not. But where I have that substantive expertise, if you want, where I have that, communicating with other professionals and other teachers through social media, maybe social media networks that are already established through your subject associations. I think where you have substantive expertise in subject matter, I think this gives us an opportunity to disseminate created resources. Mm-hmm. So that's really what I'm arguing. And I'm very much arguing that there is a need for that in that article. So I go through elements of textbooks, not just history, but economics, business studies as well. And I highlight areas that could be improved just based on my substantive expertise. Now, there's loads of areas, no doubt, that could be improved and someone with a different set of expertise could identify. So if we do this all together as a profession, in the interest of improving what we teach, we can collectively make a real difference to the quality of knowledge that's out there. And, that can come into the classroom. It can be used, I suppose, high quality subject knowledge can be used to develop higher order thinking skills, very much in the way I demonstrated there with the baptismal record versus the grave record. So you're applying procedural knowledge to figure this out. Mm-hmm. So you can have high quality resources that are making sure students who are just learning knowledge or when they're just learning knowledge, they're not wasting their time learning nonsense or stuff that's been, proved wrong. Mm-hmm. But they're also better able to answer, well, why do we know them? How do we know that? Because we're actually dealing with, established knowledge, and there is a how and a why for that. So you can bring that into the classroom as well.
And, I think that there's something really important that you said there that, really links to that spirit of collegiality, when you're sharing on, your expertise. Not only does it promote that spirit of collegiality, but when it's done right and it's done in a positive frame, like you're not pointing a finger saying to somebody saying, you don't know what you're talking about, this is the truth. You're actually doing it in a very supportive way. It can be so beneficial, to not only that person, but even just the lay person coming in, scrolling through the Twitter feed, or that kind of thing, and and seeing that kind of that respectful dialogue that happens between experts and in research and things like that, I think is really important, a really important point to make, because obviously we think there are so many, there's enough in society that's negative, and there's enough people in society that are negative, and things that happen that are just negative. So if there's a way in which through your learned knowledge can be supportive, and to others, to other academics, to other researchers, to other people, with that type of knowledge in a positive mindset, in a positive way, it can do so much and it can go so far.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's all about relationships, and it's all about us working together and trying to, I suppose, improve the system. And I think that's a really important way of change from the ground up. We are at the coalface. We are the teachers in the classrooms, and I also believe there's room for academia and teachers to communicate more in general. But well placed is someone who's a bit of both, to be able to make this kind of observation. But yeah, I definitely think we can bring about change by improving our practices together. We can certainly work together and try to achieve an improvement. But that's not to say, look, this idea, it's not to say it's without limitations and without problems. It does have problems. There's issues around, I suppose, maybe expecting teachers to do that in their spare time to solve the inadequacies of a system, especially when there's disputes like pay inequality. Not to flog a dead horse, but when those things are going on. So there's a few limitations like that.
Yeah. So, Eoin, we are near the end of our conversation together, and it's really been, enlightening, and I've learned so much from what you've had to say. Do you have any parting words of wisdom or advice for our listeners?
Well, I'm nobody to give advice, but if you're looking for words of wisdom, there is a medieval Irish maxim that's preserved in a late medieval tale, and it goes something like "Ferde fis fia fraged." Basically means inquiry improves knowledge, or is the better for knowledge is the better for inquiry. And I think that really speaks to everything we've spoken about today: the importance of carrying out research as a teacher, the importance of us looking at our own substantive expertise and seeing how we can bring that into the classroom. From the academics perspective, how can you get your research onto the ground, how you can put it into practice, what networks do we have with teachers to allow that to happen? And not just teachers, but obviously I'm talking from that perspective. So yeah, basically, I think if we remember that research is important for knowledge, and we bring that into the classroom, and we do that as teachers as well, we get the students to start doing it, and we can get academics to start disseminating the stuff in a way that we can access and use in the classroom. Brilliant. So we can all learn from that statement, I think.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. Like I said, I've learned so much, and it's been such a pleasure to have you on.
It's been an absolute pleasure to be on. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion on A Dash of Salt, a space where you'll always find fresh and current discussions on society and learning today, seasoned with just the right touch of experts in education and a dash of sociological imagination. Please be sure to like and share this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to A Dash of Salt on Podbean so that you don't miss the next episode. Thanks so much, and we'll chat again soon.